Hello. Thank you very, very much. And I am deeply honored to be here today to speak to you all. It's extraordinary how quickly Korea has grown in the specialty market and the importance that it has taken on in such quick fashion. You are all to be congratulated here for having achieved so much in so little time. I look forward to seeing the developments that happen in the future and realize that you will be major players now and in the future. I am here to speak about the future of quality coffee as I see it, paths and detours. And I will begin. Both hands are occupied here. We have to go back, I think, to the beginning of our century. In 1999, when Cup of Excellence was first born. It came to me in early 1999 to create a competition followed by an auction, an internet auction, the first of its kind in the world, to really promote single farms, which until that time were barely noticeable in any of the specialty outlets around the world at the time. We were mostly all about blended coffees and dark roast, light roast, all kinds of alternatives, but the single farm barely existed in anyone's mind, let alone the roasters who were roasting these coffees. In the last 15 years since the beginning of our times, of our century, we have seen the rise of single farm coffees and what's called direct trade. And also the return of lighter roasting, which almost seems to have disappeared in the United States with the advent of the rise of Starbucks, first in the States and then throughout the world. To my mind, the dark roast became associated, particularly in businessmen's mind, with gourmet, and the lighter roast was relegated to blue-collar type classes, and that is unfair and incorrect. This has become now the age of craftsmanship. We have, not that it didn't exist before, it did. Certainly Starbucks is to be noted for its incredibly important role in the late 80s and 90s for introducing the espresso machine and the barista and popularizing it to Americans and then the rest of the world. They were the ones who put the La Marzocco machines out there with the double boilers to it, who made the barista face the customer, and where actual communication began to happen. They professionalized the cafe world in a way that it had not been before, and really gave us a tool and a means to go further than that later in our times. So we are in the age now, I would say, of craftsmanship, because it has gone well beyond the initial step of the barista at Starbucks. Today it involves everything from the farmer, who is absolutely critical, the foundation, the literal foundation of the specialty movement is the coffee farmer. It goes from there to the processing of the green coffee, to the packaging, which has also changed dramatically now with airtight bags and such. That was not the case 15 years ago. To the way we brew coffee, to really produce the best possible expression of whatever coffee we have purchased. So we have seen really huge changes. I take you back to those early times. This was a speech that I gave to the international jury that came to Brazil in 2001. At that time, really, there was next to no communication between Asians, Americans, Europeans in the specialty world. We were all in our separate worlds. If I in Boston barely related to people in San Francisco and vice versa. We were all in our pockets, separate from one another. When we brought the jury there, I spoke to them about roasters, specialty roasters, who were really looking for something new and something better, and farmers who were desperate to sell at better prices and to start being paid in a way that helped them not only survive but to thrive. It certainly was not the case in 2001. In fact, during those terrible years, 2001, 2002, and 2003, the price of coffee dropped well below the cost of production, and many, many farmers lost their livelihoods, their farms, as did people who worked for them as well. So the point of Cup of Excellence was that roasters from around the world, specialty roasters, would gather in the producing country there for an entire week to cup the best coffees that that country had to offer, that had already been selected by a national jury that had spent weeks sorting through the hundreds of samples that were given to them. And in that competition, then, they would pick out the very finest coffees, discarding the rest. So if you were starting, I remember the first Brazilian competition in 1999, there were 800 farms participating. The international jury diminished that to about 40 coffees. The international jury then took that, and only 10 coffees were left standing at the end of that week. But they truly were extraordinary, and those coffees reached much higher prices than people had expected, and Cup of Excellence then went on to really grow and to catch the attention of more and more roasters around the world. So these coffees were then auctioned and bought by specialty roasters and brought higher prices to the farmers who first participated, first in Brazil, then in then in Guatemala, and then in Nicaragua, and now, of course, in 8 or 9 different countries. Further, the idea was that farmers themselves would begin to communicate with one another within regions, within that country, and then later from country to country as well. So a community within the producing country also started to be formed, as well as an international community of roasters. And then, of course, you also had the relationships that roasters now who would go to Cup of Excellence would then travel to go see the winning farms and connect that way as well. Many of the founders or the original buyers for the first wave of the third wave coffee, as it's still called, from counterculture, from intelligentsia, from Stumptown and other names, first came to Cup of Excellence and cupped there, and from there met many of the first or some of the very first farms that they connected with. And so what you had in the end was a world community that was now communicating for the first time. And all of this developed in the first few years of the 21st century. So this is another slide I presented back then with the mass market commercial grade coffees representing the vast bulk of coffee being sold, and that little red triangle that you see representing specialty coffee at best. It was tiny at that time. And what I spoke about was really raising that to a quality pyramid, showing segmented qualities and prices going all the way up, as high as it could possibly go, both for quality and for price, with the fair trade price being the lowest possible price you might pay for that coffee. Quite different from what was being said in those days. So the question was, how would that happen? And I explained to the jury that estate coffee represented less than 1% of specialty coffee's entire production at that time, far less. Specialty coffee really was more about blends, many different blends, each competing with each other, differences in roasts, dark roast, light roast, everything in between, and also labels, mainly fair trade, organic, and the like. But there really was not a higher quality above that. And only just beginning were a few rare farms that were beginning to rise to the surface, but nothing else. And so I suggested, let's take that triangle, that quality pyramid, turn it into a triangle, and turn it into an arrow. And then if you remove that very tiny, seemingly insignificant tip to the arrow, which represents nothing practically as a quantity of the overall production, you remove that, and then you placed a target of being the world specialty, that arrow would not go through the target and would not connect with consumers, would not light them on fire about something extra, something special to be taken in. So you put the tip back on, and then very easily the arrow goes through, and that is because of exemplary coffee. And people were there in that jury in order to find that exemplary coffee and then put it at auction. So really, Cup of Excellence was and still is a search engine. It was the first search engine to find these great coffees. It found great coffees for roasters, and of course, it found great buyers for farmers. And the development has been ever increasing, ever accelerating since those early days. Sorry, that's a second of the same. So with Cup of Excellence came a much greater emphasis on cupping for excellence in cup quality, far beyond what had been done before. We saw many people come in from the industry, particularly the old-timers, people who had been around for a while. Their style of cupping, many of them, not all by any means, was they would cup in a matter of 10 or 15 minutes. The coffee was relatively hot. They cupped the coffee. They made their decisions immediately, and that was that. That's a value system that is based on acceptability and not something that involves the heart, all the senses, and the desire for finding something better than the last cup you had. So this was the slide that I showed. You could basically cup a coffee that next to other coffees that were not as good seemed to be really excellent. Somewhere in around fine or extra fine. But that very same coffee, and this is the same color gray, when placed against really fine coffees, suddenly really was revealed to be of poor and unacceptable quality. That's the same gray, and it's just an optical illusion. But the same thing goes for cupping. We need to cup over and over again, reducing the number of coffees against better and better coffees to find really the very best that is there. So it is all about savoring coffee. It's about cupping coffee when you really got good ones and you're really looking for the very best, 40 minutes or more in the cupping, from hot to nearly stone cold, and letting the coffee over that time to reveal itself. And this is something that I also really preach to many consumers. I give a 3-hour slideshow and tasting to customers who come, 50 to 100 people at a time. And this is the first thing and the key thing that I tell them, that they need to not sip the first sip and judge that coffee. It is a 20 to 30 minute savoring of that cup of coffee. We're not talking espresso here, but rather drip or French press or AeroPress or siphon. And during that time, that coffee will undergo changes as it goes from hot to room temperature. The chemistry changes, the texture changes, everything about it changes. And to really enjoy that cup, you need to note how it changes throughout. And a great coffee, a complex coffee, will change as that time period goes. And this is, the more we can get people into that, the more they will go from milk coffees and sugar and such to actually drinking the coffee black and really enjoying it. And the two key things that you always need to look for are sweetness, which has to do with the ripeness, and the clarity or clean cup aspect, which has to do with how well crafted the processing of the coffee was. Those are absolutely the key ingredients. The removal of the seed completely from the fruit without in any way damaging that seed and affecting its flavor is absolutely critical. And really, I often think that all of us, from the processor on, act as midwives to what can be an extraordinary product given to us by nature. And it is really up to us to bring it out and let it express its fullness to us. So the key focus for Cup of Excellence was finding really craft-driven people who are obsessed with the craft itself, whose farms, however, also had to be in the right locations. If you're at 3,000 feet, you're going to have great difficulty producing the highest qualities. And of course, this is going to become a greater problem with weather and with climate conditions changing the way they are in the globe today. The craft-driven farmer is somebody who has a compulsive need to really excel at what they do, even regardless of what they may be compensated for. And I have met such farmers. And these are the farmers that we really need to look for and compensate properly. And that task has just begun. And I must say that the Asians are doing a better job at it than Europe or the United States. So in the beginning, we had what I would call neat clarity. It was clear we were, this new group of people who were forming really had a clear vision of single farms going out, finding those farmers, and bringing it to consumers. Since that, 15 years have gone by, and we have seen wave after wave of innovation, change, and new products coming on board, branching out over and over again from the farm, new varieties being introduced to processing, from at first washed coffees, but later honey coffees, pulp natural coffees, to more recently with the barista competitions, signature coffee drinks, mixology, making different combinations of coffee with other products as well, along with the traditional cappuccinos and such. And more recently, cold brew, which has taken the specialty world by storm, and even more recently, green coffee that is put into barrels used for wine or bourbon or whiskey or other kinds of drinks, and being literally flavored by those barrels. And on it goes. So we are getting to a key point where instead of that neatness that we had before, we now have something where there is a bit of potential confusion that is taking place. This can be a very good thing. It leads to creativity, which is what we're seeing, innovation, and discovery. And these are all very exciting lines that specialty is taking. Also, on the other hand, there are dangers involved with this. The dominance of novelty for its own sake. Force over subtlety. Often coffee can be made so strong that you cannot taste within that coffee. It reaches you like a block and does not really permit investigating the subtler, richer, more complex aspects of a truly great coffee. And then performance can overwhelm substance. Then you have the visual that takes over, and the coffee itself does not come to its full potential. So single farm coffee, that theme, is in danger of being unfocused or not clearly emphasized, while still right now in its infancy. It is still in its infancy. Farmers, very few of them are highly successful, and many who produce great quality just cling to barely over subsistence. So the question is, can we refocus to some degree while maintaining the innovation? Because quite frankly, cafes need to thrive themselves. They need to be providing all kinds of products to the public, not just single farm, but concoctions, great drinks, espresso drinks, all the things that capture people's imaginations. I may have a date, and I may want the single cup of coffee, the single farm, and my date might want something extraordinary, beautiful to look at, with milk and cream. And we as cafe owners need to present both of these things done with great craftsmanship on our own in order to keep people coming, in order for us to thrive, to do the job we need to do. So we can change some of the imagery, I would suggest, to begin with. For instance, the origin of coffee. And my question is this the best we can do with the goat story? Is that really what we want to be talking about here when coffee is going up higher and higher in price, when both tea and wine have images that are very different from that? And I would suggest we send the goat packing along with the mule, and we start to really talk more seriously about where coffee comes from. Tea and wine were from the gods, but of course coffee was born really in our times, only a few hundred years ago in reality. There are no gods at that time already, and I think we need a more elevated purpose, to really, an elevated story to really bring across the message we want to bring. And I would point out that Asia was very important, probably, in the development of coffee as an aesthetic and social drink in our times. It is in 1425 that Chinese fleets make it to the Red Sea, where Yemen and Ethiopia almost meet. There they introduce people to tea. And they come several times over the next few years to this region, and then these fleets disappear forever, never to return. But the search would seem to be on, and in a matter of 25 years, around 1450, the first coffee houses in the Middle East start to open up, and coffee begins to flourish as a beverage, as an aesthetic, social drink. And so from the wild forests of Ethiopia, which I can't seem to do, but down below in the southwest of Ethiopia, you have Terroir in the very dry eastern regions of Ethiopia, and Yemen start to, for the first time, really commercially produce coffee. And then all that coffee is brought to a port in Yemen called Al-Muka, and this then is introduced to Europe in the following years. The coffee becomes known as mocha, coming from the word of Al-Muka. And this is where the word mocha first came from. And we still refer to coffees from these two regions as mocha coffee. So that's one of the stories I would recommend really bringing out to people. Talking about coffee itself, to my mind, there are at least 6 flavor sources for that coffee. Terroir, which we'll talk about in a second, is the first one. Nutrition, the care that is given to the plant, is the next one. Then comes the variety of the particular coffee plant, many varieties having unique flavors to impart to the coffee itself. The fourth is the process. How is the coffee taken out of the fruit and dried and stabilized? And of course, that has become more complex now with extrinsic flavoring that is happening by allowing fermentation to take longer than normal and adding its own flavor to the coffee. Then aging of coffee. Not just as roasted, stale coffee, but as green coffee. It ages and flavor transforms dramatically. And then finally in the roast, coffee stales as well. So all of these things alter the flavor of coffee or bring flavors to that coffee. The first one then is terroir, which is really a taste of place. It comes from the French concept, from Burgundy, where wines were one of the first areas of France to develop, and the idea of terroir, where it was grown, and that making a difference was really critical. And so grapes grown within a few meters of grapes of the same variety grown elsewhere could actually be superior because of that one spot. And that would involve, key is soil, climate, altitude for coffee, topography, exposition. Is this morning sun? Is it afternoon sun? How much sun does it get? The age of the trees, perhaps, and the root system itself, and even perhaps other plants around it. We don't know, but it's a possibility. In any case, to my mind, the essence of the very finest quality coffee really can be best described by this quote that I got from Matt Kramer, who writes for Wine Spectator. He wrote this many years ago. Each terroir should be allowed to be itself and produce wine for which nature endowed it. The winemaker's signature is permissible so long as it does not substitute for terroir. Terroir here is the most subtle, the most difficult thing to attain, and yet the most valuable, again, from my personal point of view. So the question is, should we in specialty be given special attention to that? And that is where I again bring up the image that we, in the very finest coffees, really are midwives. And it is what the farmer has produced that we are seeking to bring to full expression. So next one is the processing itself, in which in 2000, the early 2000s, processing was all about producing clear coffee, clean coffee. And a certain amount of fruitiness that would come from the fermentation itself by over-fermenting the coffee or by allowing the coffee to stay in sherry a little bit longer. They would develop fruit notes that were found to overwhelm the flavor of terroir that could be in the coffee. More subtle, less loud, but more in the long term rewarding, and less of a single note to it. So this fruitiness has become much more important, as it has in wine, by the way. In wine, you have a similar movement taking place right now, this one produced by a microorganism called Brettanomyces. And you can go for wine tastings, and they will introduce this wine to you as a funky wine. And the question becomes not rejecting it. Specialty cafes like my own do sell this coffee as well. It is part of the overall variety, the bouquet of coffees that we have to offer. And they are a fun coffee to drink and have their value at different times with different products, and for many people are the thing they really love in coffee, and we should not deny them that. So I see that as part of the mix, frankly, just as I do as no single roast being the key roast to sell. We should be doing light roast, dark roast, and everything in between for different times of day, for different foods, for different moods. All of these things are critical. But when it comes, again, to the very top, the peak of that quality pyramid, that's where I go for lighter roast and for great clarity in the coffee. Funky, I have also seen, because I do a lot of tastings with people where we do an Ethiopian that is washed next to an Ethiopian that is a natural, and we see often the public split into two groups. Some who find what some people call funky as being stinky, and others finding it absolutely extraordinary. There are thresholds that are different for every single individual, and so we need to broaden the offerings that we have to really please as many people as possible. This is good for the industry and good for the farmer. So terroir itself, though, is subtle and it's complex. And I describe it often as a translucent web of flavors that, with a really very fine coffee, a cup of excellence, exemplary winner or such, changes as you drink it over that 20 to 30 minutes, like different transparencies coming through. Now you talk about also the area where it's grown and such, and of course we see that coffees, terroir-type coffees coming from these farms, are not always expressed every single year. There are years in which, because of disease, such as the rust that has devastated parts of the Americas in the last several years, can really reduce the nutrition that a plant takes, and the seeds no longer are able to express the sweetness and complexity. They can turn red and they can turn ripe, and yet within those fruits, the seeds themselves have not fully ripened and fully developed. It varies from year to year. So next is coffee varieties. And interestingly enough, we have a number of neutral, relatively neutral type varieties. They do have a flavor note, but much more subdued. And from those you have the more traditional ones, the Tipica, the Bourbon, the Caturra. But you can also see that when Caturra is grown in Central America, does not taste the way Caturra tastes from the high regions of Colombia. A completely different flavor note. And yet it's exactly the same variety. So here is terroir operating, to me, in a more clear fashion. And then you have very powerfully flavored varieties, of which the most obvious is the geisha coffee. But many coffees from Ethiopia as well have these unique flavor notes. So looking at that for a moment, you have the Arabica land races from southwestern Ethiopia that are first grown in East Ethiopia, Harar and Yemen, very dry regions, these places. And for the next 150, 200 years, that's exclusively where they are grown to be imbibed in the rest of the world. Then the plants get transplanted finally to East Africa and to Asia, areas which are wetter now, where the wet process is developed, where there is more rainfall, more water. They could not do washed method in Yemen or East Ethiopia because of the lack of rain there. Here, these places, it became critical to do so. But this meant that these varieties that had been left in very dry zones were now very subject to disease. They had in fact lost their resistance, and perhaps also their flavors had changed over that period of time. And so in they come to the Americas, the Tipica and the Bourbon, very narrow genetic base, and from that you get the cultivars, the Catuai, Caturra, Mondonovo, and so on. And in the middle of all of that, in 2004, arrives geisha. Actually, it arrived in the 1930s as something that was disease-resistant that Americans were very interested in, but it was such a low producer, people gave up on it. And it is only more recently that the geisha has come to prominence as something we look for. So what obscures terroir? Additives in powerful doses. Too much power, which I mentioned earlier in the brewing sense. Processing. Natural and honey coffees add another flavor to the coffee besides what is intrinsic in the bean itself. And I will go over that in a moment still further. The aging of green coffee. We get coffee that was maybe harvested in February, March. It arrives to our warehouses sometime in June, maybe July, maybe later, and that coffee immediately is beginning to age. We have improved the situation a good deal with the packaging we now do, Grain Pro, vacuum, and such, but still that coffee does age, and in a matter of months, it begins to gain woody notes, lose its sweetness, the acidity starts to change, and the more complex, subtle, sweeter nature of the terroir begins to dissipate. Dark roast. Again, very valid for many reasons, but the dark roast, the caramel and the phenols produced by darker roasts are like a sauce that overwhelm the flavor, again, of terroir. And finally, cold brew, which is a concoction. And it is, again, it really destroys the terroir aspect, not the varietal aspect. You can still taste the geisha, you can still taste a lot of those aspects, but the oxidation and the fact that the cold water is not producing the acids anymore definitely eliminate that expression of terroir. So this is an example to me of what you can get, which can be very popular again, so it should not be shunned, but it is a doorway for people to enter into coffee and perhaps explore further as their tastes evolve and become more sophisticated. So we come to that coffee bean inside the cherry, and what I am after with terroir is the expression coming from the intrinsic flavor, the coffee bean notes themselves. And what can be added from the fruit is the fruitiness that comes from it, which is in the honey coffees, the natural coffees, and such. Again, valid in its own way, but I think in some respects, again, this is very personal. We'll be selling more of the Ethiopian harars, the Yemen mochas and such, if we can get them, because they come, and Brazil, because they come from countries that truly have to produce it that way. It's natural for them to do so. In wetter climates, you have greater microorganism activity, and it is much harder to control the process than it is in the drier countries. So getting it just right is not easy and involves some amount of luck, more so than doing a pure washed coffee. So we have the concoction, which really to me is more beer-based. Many in the United States at least are based on a beer culture, not so much wine. And this is where we see a lot of some of the innovation taking place, versus wine, which is the single farm idea of drinking a Bordeaux or an Italian wine and such. So you have the development of designer blends, and you also have the development of cold brew, where acidity, which we all speak about as a positive thing because of high altitude coffees being higher quality and such, and yet with cold brew we are singing the praises of it because it has no acidity or very little acidity. To me, a real contradiction. But it is very hard to produce, especially in cafes or even at home, a properly made, perfectly extracted coffee that is made iced right away, because you have to use very little water compared to a lot of coffee to make a very powerful extract, to take that very hot coffee, refrigerate it, and add ice cubes all in the first 20 minutes of its existence. Because that coffee, once it's brewed, begins to lose its flavor almost immediately. And that's the secret of a great iced coffee, one that can be thirst-quenching and just as satisfying as cold brew, but not possible to bottle it. So raw coffee ages, and it ages in a negative way for the most part. So you have now, to combat that, oxygen-free packaging, but that does not do the entire job. It just slows it down. And then you have temperature, and that really does affect coffee as well. So here you have the Grain Pro or the vacuum packaging that was developed. But what I have done, and some roasters are beginning to experiment in, is actually taking the coffee and then freezing it as well. A coffee that arrives to you really fresh with all the flavors there can be frozen and kept for years without any noticeable change whatsoever, and with real retention of the terroir aspect. It allows you to sell a great coffee not over 3 or 4 months seasonally, but over the entire year, and even for the following year to bring out a vintage if you want to do so. And so I find that really exciting and enabling, both for me and for the farmer. But again, studies need to be done. What is the ideal temperature? How can we freeze or whatever the coffee quicker, reducing the size of the crystals and therefore any destruction of the bean itself? So a few final thoughts to you with all these thoughts that I have, which I'm sharing with you today. For a thriving, expanding quality market offering leadership roles to farmers, coffee farms need to be branded as well. I know these sessions are about brand, and those that have the least amount of brand are the farms themselves. They are barely noticeable. Some of the great coffees that have real followers are number only in the hundreds. But when the day comes where the farm itself is as desirable or more desirable than the roaster brand, that is the day that farmers really gain a security and an upward mobility that they are only just beginning to perceive today. This is a slide that I gave in 2001, but it's still very relevant. Tea and wine can go into the hundreds and even thousands of dollars. Coffee has barely risen past the $20 mark. Back then it was under $20. Today, in the States at least, and I know in Asia it may be very different, but certainly there, a coffee over $20 really starts to lose volume, and over 30, it's almost impossible. So, and that is still the case today. So farmers need to know their coffees. Also, they need to be cuppers and consumers of their best coffees. The culture in the country of origin must change. And the sooner it does so, the better. Coffee cultures need to be developed in growing countries. The roaster's task, to my mind, at this high level of terroir is full development, bringing dimension to that coffee, bringing balance in, and bringing that transparency that I have been talking about. The barista's task, correct extraction, power adjustment, so it's not overpowering, but just right, and communication, more important than the performance. Automation will take over and produce finer and finer quality. The barista's role should and will change towards that of a sommelier, the person who communicates what is going on. And technology, a key driver, will keep driving things ideally towards better quality. Soil analysis, environment, processing, milling, packaging, roasting, and sorting, by the way, and grinding, brewing. In all of those areas, development is taking place. So my final slide, I still see the development of multiple layers of qualities and prices with many different roles to be played, many different products to be developed, and I thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Howell. Now I'd like to have some questions from the floor. So, yeah, considering time constraint, we'll receive 2 questions from the floors. If you have any question, please raise your hand. Oh, we'll bring you microphone, sorry.
So you talked in, first I want to say thank you for a fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it. And I was sharing the comments actually online, and at least 200 people were saying how fantastic it was. And I have a question regarding terroir and the term single origin.
Yeah.
You didn't touch much on the term, and a lot of people are talking about it at the moment. What do you think about it? Do you think it's a restrictive term?
Well, I just think single origin doesn't get down to the fundamental word farm. So I keep using farm. I would say single origin, and we do that. It's sort of like if you're buying a wine, you might spend $50 for a particular farm or estate of wine in Bordeaux, or you might get a bottle that says Bordeaux. So that's an origin wine, Bordeaux. The minute I buy Aubryon or something else, now it's a single farm, a single estate. So that's why I make the difference.
No, I agree entirely, because it doesn't really pay credit to the different regions at all.
Correct, exactly.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Any other questions?
Ah.
Okay, there you go.
As you mentioned earlier about the branding the farmer, so I'm pretty sure Mr. Abdullah will talk about in his session, but I want to ask you about how you plan it about the branding the farmer, especially in Asia, because it's really hard to make the specialty coffee in Asia.
Yeah, it's around the world that way. And one of the reasons I'm here is not just to give a keynote speech, but to listen to the other speakers, because hopefully there are people who know more about branding than I do. My effort was really with Cup of Excellence, the beginning of that. But yes, that is the big question. How do we get the farm name out there and give it the branding that it requires? Certainly it has to do with the way it's packaged. It has to do, again, with country of origin as well. When tourists go to Guatemala or whatever, they're beginning to find cafes now in Antigua and Guatemala City that will actually serve. El Injerto, one of the most famous farms today in Guatemala, is actually having their own cafe. So it's just the very first baby steps, but more needs to be done. Many farmers are considering roasting in country of origin and then shipping out. I find that a real problem because of the freshness issue. So I still think it needs to be roasted, but will there ever be a point if that where the consumer will say, no, I'm not coming to Starbucks, or I'm not coming to George Howell Coffee, I'm coming to buy Mamuto, right? And I want to make sure you guys roasted it right, because if not, I'm going to the other roaster, right? That would be an amazing moment.
Thank you so much.
Very far in the future.
Can we still have one more question?
Yes.
So we have one applicant. Okay, one last question there.
Hi.
Yes.
You talked about the fair trade price, so I have a question. I read a recent article about the fair trade coffee, and a lot of people try to consume fair trade coffee
Yes.
with the aim of helping the small farmers. But this article that I read was having a very negative view about the fair trade coffee, and because of the commission system and everything. So I would like to hear about your thoughts based on this subject.
Yeah, very interesting, fair trade. I would say that fair trade has had a really critical role to play, both in coffee and especially other commodities as well. It certainly is born in Europe with Max Havelaar many years ago. I think it can be best understood, and again, this is my personal take, as a labor union movement. It is one in which Max Havelaar is horrified by the conditions in Indonesia with the large estate farms and such, and how poorly people are being treated who work in these areas. And from there you get the beginning of the fair trade type movement. With specialty and its rise, fair trade finds a way to get to the public through their own specialty cafes. And so they begin to grow more and more with that, and with cafes that are often exclusively fair trade, and the whole idea of social conscience. So with that said, I remember when I had Coffee Connection through 1994, and I was cupping fair trade, I would always cup lines. So let's say I'm doing Guatemalans, and there would be some fair trade, also some organics. And I never picked those coffees. They were never anywhere near the best tasting coffees on that table. So that was a real problem to me. And that's why I rarely, if ever, had it. If I did, I would say loudly, this is fair trade, or this is organic, and feel good about it. All too often, and this takes me to organic in a way, all too often organic has been sold to farmers as a way to make more money, without any emphasis being put on the quality. So I know when I went in 2000 to Peru as a consultant, there I found all these farmers had been sold on organic without necessarily being given the real means to give the proper nutrition to those plants on the one hand, and suddenly finding themselves in a crowd of other farmers all selling organic, so what happened to the price? So these are real problems, and these labels need to take into consideration the complexities that they bring with them and how they are applied in the messaging to farmers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. With that, we conclude the keynote speech. Thank you so much. Please give him another round of applause.